Despite Admiral Tanaka's tactical success at Tassafaronga, the supplies he'd been charged with delivering hadn't made it to the starving Japanese army troops, and subsequent supply runs had seen precious little success either. Some supply runs didn't sustain casualties, but had been forced to withdraw without delivering their supplies due to attacks by PT boats and aircraft. In other cases, intercepting US forces had succeeded in taking out Japanese Navy ships, such as the destroyer Terazuki, which exploded, and the submarine I-3, which was torpedoed. But even when these efforts didn't stop the supply run completely, over 80% of the supplies were never recovered or brought ashore. By contrast, at the other end of the island, a positive embarrassment of supplies was building up, to the point that some fairly large-scale pilfering, including well over 20,000 cases of beer spirited off one newly arrived supply ship, could simply be written off by the US as the cost of doing business on Guadalcanal. With ship and submarine losses mounting, and no real benefit being accrued, the Japanese Navy had soon proposed abandoning the island. The Japanese army had opposed this, but at the end of 1942, the Emperor approved an evacuation that would move the battle from the southern end of the Solomon Island chain to midway up it, on New Georgia Island. This was an important milestone in the Pacific Campaign, as it marked the first time an entrenched Japanese position would be forced into retreat, as opposed to operations such as Coral Sea and Midway, which had merely checked further advances. However, whilst they might have been beaten, the Japanese still had plenty of military assets in the theatre, and more than enough skilled officers to put into place a comprehensive evacuation plan. Seemingly paradoxically, the first stage of this was the landing of more troops on the 14th of January 1943, but this wasn't quite as mad as it sounds. The existing Japanese army troops on the island were exhausted, starving, and low on almost every kind of military supply. As a rear guard, they'd be of minimal use, whilst the new battalion, which was fresh and well equipped, would be able to take up the role with vigour that would belie its relatively small actual strength in terms of manpower. Elements of the already in place troops began to retreat to the western end of the island a couple of weeks later, covered by a massive increase in Japanese air missions, utilising well over 400 aircraft of the Japanese Navy and Japanese Army's respective air forces, including the carrier Zuikaku's air group, which was temporarily on loan to the air bases of Rabaul. This aimed to gain temporary command of the skies in order to inhibit US recon efforts, which might discover what they were up to, and prevent the Cactus Air Force from exploiting the situation if they did somehow realise what was going on, as well as to ensure that more of the destroyers that were to act as evacuation transports would be able to get away undamaged. A small fleet carrier, a light carrier, both surviving Congo-class battlecruisers and their escort groups also positioned themselves for distant cover. Reports of both Yamato-class waiting at Truk also seem to indicate to the US Navy that caution would be required. With the start of 1943, the Japanese also changed all their radio ciphers, which set back Allied code-breaking efforts and temporarily left them having to base much of their work on guessing Japanese intentions by the levels of traffic detected in various areas, rather than the actual contents of the messages which they were detecting. As a result, whilst noting the increased Japanese efforts in the area, the Allied analysts concluded that a major fleet build-up, an air superiority campaign, and the seeming renewed vigour in the Japanese Army's forces on land must therefore mean that a new offensive was being prepared. This could be bad. Whilst the US had far more and far better equipped forces on the ground in reality, many of the Marines had been fighting constantly since landing there the previous summer, and were nearing a state of near total combat exhaustion. Additionally, the land-based elements of US air power could only muster just over 170 aircraft in opposition to the Japanese, plus a few squadrons of heavy bombers of questionable utility that were on call from New Guinea. But there was a balancing element present in the form of the US Navy, Led by Admiral Halsey, the forces present included 2 fleet carriers, the USS Saratoga and the now somewhat held together with duct tape but still just about going USS Enterprise, plus some new friends, a handful of brand new shiny, if somewhat slow, escort carriers. Admiral Lee could now call upon the services of both USS Washington and USS North Carolina, as well as the newly arrived USS Indiana, plus there were a few older standard-type battleships in reserve somewhere. There were also over a dozen cruisers and nearly 50 destroyers, the cruiser numbers having been bolstered in the months since Tassafaronga by both repaired and newly commissioned ships. These forces put the number of aircraft available to counter the Japanese efforts at well over 500 in total, although with the need to refuel the carriers, not all of these could be available at all times. In addition, fresh US troops were arriving, and the exhausted Marines were able to take something of a break. On land, therefore, concluding that the best defence was a good offence, the US troops began what they thought was a spoiling attack, and rapidly found themselves taking position after position, since most Japanese troops in the area had already withdrawn. However, cautious of a trap due to the assessment that a new offensive was about to begin, and running into stiff resistance from the freshly arrived troops in their pre-prepared defensive positions, the US offensive slowed, just on the cusp of discovering the truth of the situation. In the air, things were also hotting up, although in a disjointed way typical of Japanese operations, and on the 25th of January, a large sweep by almost 60 Imperial Japanese Navy fighters was launched, and 2 days later, another raid by 74 Imperial Japanese Army fighters and 9 light bombers went in. In total, 10 Japanese fighters went down in exchange for 7 US aircraft, but the damage to Henderson Field and its aircraft that could have occurred if a combined force of 134 fighters, as well as Japanese Army light and Japanese Navy medium bombers, had all been sent in at once, was avoided. Regardless of these events, the continued flow of new men and supplies being sent to back up the US troops on the island wasn't abating, and Halsey reasoned that since every other Japanese army offensive on land had been accompanied by a Japanese Navy offensive at sea, he should position his considerable forces to meet them. Thus, the fleet was dispersed into 5 task forces, including the convoy of reinforcements, TG 62.8, and its covering force, Task Force 18, composed of the heavy cruisers Wichita, Chicago, and Louisville, the new light cruisers Cleveland, Montpelier, and Columbia, and half a dozen destroyers, with some more ordered to join up with them later in their advance, and in theory, 2 of the escort carriers. The idea was to provide close protection for the convoy as it was escorted in. Then the warships would sweep up over the same familiar battleground around Savo Island, picking up the forward screening element of destroyers on the way. The officer in charge, Rear Admiral Robert Giffen, decided that submarines were the bigger threat, and to be fair, Japanese Navy submarines were actually tracking his force. And so he set his force into anti-submarine formation, with the destroyers leading in a search arc, followed by his cruisers in 2 columns, heavies on the right and lights on the left. Determining the escort carriers were too slow and that the air threat was negligible, he left the escort carriers behind with a destroyer each and forged on ahead, which left the bulk of his command with a total of 8 destroyers available. The relatively unmolested Japanese Navy submarines happily reported his every move, and 32 Imperial Japanese Navy medium bombers armed with torpedoes took off on the 29th of January. -1, which shortly developed engine trouble, they headed in as the sun began to set. Aboard the US Navy ships, their radar began to track the incoming bombers. But Giffen had gone mysteriously silent, and like a number of other US Navy admirals before him in this campaign, had left no previous standing orders. As darkness fell, the combat air patrol from the escort carriers was forced to head back for the night. Thus, unopposed and guided by a complex series of coloured flares dropped by scout aircraft to inform the bombers of the direction, number and composition of US Navy forces, the Japanese bombers took their time to set up a perfect attack run, looping around the forward screen of destroyers and their dangerous batteries of dual-purpose 5-inch guns to come in from the darkness of the eastern horizon, whilst twilight from the west highlighted the heavy cruisers of Givens formation rather nicely. 16 G4M bombers headed in first, but luck was oddly enough with both sides. All the torpedoes were dropped, but all the torpedoes missed. But the surprise and darkness, on the other hand, was enough that only a single bomber was shot down. The US Navy ship survived partially through sharp turns back and forth to throw off any aim that might have been accomplished, but with the excitement apparently over, Giffen concluded that this was it for the night, and ordered a nice, calm, straight-line course once again. But even as the ships settled in on their courses, flares blossomed above them once more, and the 15 waiting G3Ms of the second wave pounced. Within minutes, USS Chicago had been hit by 2 torpedoes and was dead in the water. Wichita took another hit, but with incredible fortune, the weapon failed to detonate. Giffen now ordered all guns to cease fire and the formation to slow down and reverse course. In the gathering darkness, this actually had a good effect, as the lack of gun flashes meant the US ships were now concealed from their airborne opponents, unless another recon aircraft found them and dropped even more flares. The sweep was abandoned, and the Louisville took Chicago in tow. Halsey reacted quickly. Dawn saw a combat air patrol from Enterprise sitting over the force, and a tug on the way. But as the 30th of January drew on, more and more Japanese aircraft appeared, like sharks drawn to wounded prey. A coast watcher spotted still more torpedo bombers heading Task Force 18's way, and Halsey ordered all undamaged cruisers out of the area, leaving the combat air patrol and the more agile destroyers to protect the Chicago, with Enterprise and the 2 escort carriers primed to launch more fighters when the inevitable strike was spotted. Now, things started to go even more wrong. Of the 10-strong combat air patrol, 4 were distracted by another Japanese scout aircraft, leaving 6 fighters in position. Radar spotted the raid, and Enterprise launched another 10 fighters, but the escort carriers failed to launch quickly enough, and so only the Enterprise's aircraft would be available. The bombers came in and seemed to head straight for the fleet carrier. Half of the remaining combat air patrol fighters swept in, only to see the bombers wheel and dive on the Chicago instead. Destroyer anti-aircraft fire and fighter machine gun fire scythed into the 11 bombers, but the last-minute course change meant that only 2 of them fell. 9 torpedoes then hit the water, followed shortly thereafter by 6 more bombers, but whilst only 3 of the bombers would escape the battle, the damage had been done. 1 torpedo slammed into the destroyer La Valette, crippling it, whilst 4 more punched into Chicago, and almost immediately Captain Davis ordered the crew to abandon ship. This proved to be a wise choice, as it meant that 1,049 men made it to safety, although sadly 62 men would not make it out of the ship. Chicago was gone in less than 20 minutes. One final strike wave of bombers had been dispatched, but it failed to find anything and went home instead. The fleet tug, USS Navajo, found itself staring forlornly at the tail end of a broken cable, but swapped to towing the La Valette instead, and the last elements of Task Force 18 headed for Espiritu Santo, thus concluding the Battle of Rennell Island. This engagement proved to have mixed consequences. On the one hand, the US Navy had lost yet another heavy cruiser. On the other, the Japanese Navy was down 11 experienced torpedo bomber crews and their valuable aircraft. But back on the US's side, the distraction had allowed the latest convoy to land its fresh men and supplies and continue to relieve the exhausted US Marines without major incident. But back in the Japanese Navy's favour, Task Force 18 had been supposed to be the point force. All the other US Navy forces were further south, expecting a major Japanese Navy push, and its absence thus left the northern end of Guadalcanal relatively free for the incoming Japanese Navy destroyers. But elsewhere on the same night, the large Japanese submarine I-1 was attempting to deliver supplies to Guadalcanal following the loss of I-3 to PT boats. Japanese Navy headquarters had advised the submarine to only surface to land the supplies at night in light of the previous loss, but when she did so, she found waiting for her the New Zealand minesweepers Moa and Kiwi. The latter vessel heard I-1 on her hydrophones and had begun to close in. Spotting the 600-ton vessels approaching, I-1 thought that they were torpedo boats and dived. A good defence against such craft, but exactly the wrong thing to do when your attackers are armed with depth charges. With the combined mass of the two ships only actually about half that of the submarine, staying on the surface and fighting it out would probably actually have been the better option. I-1 in fact being far more heavily armed in the surface gun department than either minesweeper. However, she dived, and Kiwi duly dropped a dozen depth charges on her in 2 batches, the explosions springing leaks which short-circuited equipment and sent I-1 into an out-of-control dive even further. This increased the pressure on the damaged hull, which in turn sprang even more leaks, and with water now flooding the torpedo room and the submarine's batteries, adding the wonders of chlorine gas to the situation, I-1 found herself having to pull out of a dive that had gone down to more than twice her test depth. I-1 gradually surfaced and limped towards the shore on her one remaining propeller. Kiwi now engaged the sub in a surface gunfight, with Moa helpfully firing star shells so that they could see. Luckily, Kiwi's gunners were good, and she landed a number of early hits, taking out the Japanese gunners, and the Japanese crew began to prepare to repel boarders, as the diminutive Kiwi rammed the gigantic Japanese sub twice, whilst a fresh Japanese deck gun crew began landing hits on their tiny opponent. After the second ramming attack, 2 of the submarine's crew decided to preempt the New Zealanders and tried counterboarding the Kiwi, with katanas in hand, but a third ramming attack and its associated impact threw them off. The damage was adding up for the hapless sub, but Kiwi was hurting herself almost as badly and fell back, leaving Moa to take up the battle. But the tough submarine took the punishment and kept on going for a while before running aground and keeling over to starboard. With their sub finally sinking, the surviving crew began to abandon ship, swimming the remaining short distance to Guadalcanal. Come dawn, artillery on shore forced the New Zealand ships to retire, and a few days later some of the crew swam out with demo charges, rendering the wreck unsalvageable. Although, rightfully worried that the US Navy would recover the ship's codebooks, the Japanese forces would attack the wreck several more times before deciding, correctly, that the codes that were aboard had been compromised and they'd have to change them all again. Admiral Mikawa, whose cruiser force had opened the naval aspect of the Guadalcanal Campaign, now found himself supervising the evacuation effort, placing Admiral Hashimoto in charge of the destroyers that would actually recover the troops, whilst Mikawa kept the cruisers assigned to him back as a reserve. On the 1st of February, the first evacuation run began. American troops were landing on the south coast of the island, trying to cut off what they thought was a tactical retreat south by the Japanese army, and as the 4 escorting destroyers could potentially have posed a threat to the Japanese Navy evacuation convoy, a strike force of Japanese Navy fighters and dive bombers was sent after them. Although, in yet another display of very little cooperation, this force was only half the size of a 53-strong strike that had been sent by the Japanese army earlier in the day in another effort to go after Henderson Field. That effort had netted nothing other than losing a fighter. However, luck was with the Japanese Navy strike force. The escorting US destroyers thought that the Vals and Zeros were aircraft of the Cactus Air Force, and didn't open fire until the Vals had already entered into their dives. That mistake cost the US Navy the USS De Haven sunk and the USS Nicholas damaged, along with 3 Cactus Air Force Wildcats who came to help being shot down in exchange for 5 Vals and 3 Zeros being taken out. But, critically for the Japanese Navy, the remaining destroyers were now occupied rescuing survivors and towing the Nicholas, and therefore could not act against Hashimoto's ships. These 20 destroyers were split into 11 transports and 9 escorts. The Cactus Air Force and the PT boats did their best to stop what they thought was another supply run, but they only succeeded in damaging the Makinami, Hashimoto's flagship, which also took Fumizuki out of the operation as she was assigned to tow Makinami to safety. However, the efforts cost the US 4 aircraft and 3 PT boats. The 11 transporting destroyers picked up almost 5,000 emaciated walking skeletons that had once been most of the 38th Division of the Japanese Army, heading back home without any loss to the transports, although the escorting destroyer Makigumo exploded just as they were about to leave. Cause unknown, possibly a mine. As the rearguard action heated up, Admiral Kondo sent 2 destroyers to replace the damaged Makinami and the lost Makigumo. 3 days later, on the 4th of February, the second evacuation convoy set out. Once again, the Cactus Air Force attacked, and once again a destroyer was damaged and had to be towed away. This time it was Maikaze, with Nagatsuki the one doing the towing. This effort cost the Cactus Air Force 11 aircraft, and the Japanese Navy a single 0. This run otherwise went without incident, managing to take off almost 4,000 more men. With almost 9,000 men evacuated, over 2/3 of the Japanese Army's remaining force was off Guadalcanal. But despite about 50,000 men of their own, the US forces believed the convoys to have been supply and reinforcement missions, and so they remained cautious as they gradually took formerly Japanese-held positions. Worried now that Halsey's more distant forces might be closing in, the Japanese heavy units under Kondo headed to within a day's sailing of Guadalcanal, and on the 7th, the third and final evacuation run was made. No further reinforcement destroyers had been sent, and so the 18 ships headed in. Once again, the Cactus Air Force attacked, and for a third time damaged a destroyer which had to be towed away. Today's victim being the Isokaze, with the Kawakaze being the escort and tow. This time, the aircraft losses were 1 apiece. Like the second run, this would also then proceed without any further incident, the last approximately 2,000 troops being loaded before the ship's boats made sweeps of the shore, with the men aboard the boats shouting to the shoreline to make sure that no stragglers remained. As the sun rose on the 8th of February, the US troops advanced again, but this time there was no gunfire, only the odd body and a few Japanese Army troops who had been judged too weak to move. By the afternoon, the reality of the 3 convoys had become apparent, and Halsey received a message stating that the Tokyo Express no longer has a terminus on Guadalcanal. Whilst the evacuation itself had been a stunning success, costing the Japanese only a single destroyer actually sunk, it was still a retreat, and to quote Churchill, wars are not won by evacuations. Furthermore, the Japanese army had committed 36,000 troops to the campaign and only gotten just over 10,500 back, and the massively deprived state of the troops took that number down to around 10,000 within a few more days as illness and starvation took yet another final toll. Another 3,000 would not be combat capable for a long time to come, and many of the remaining 7,000 would need significant periods of R&R before they would be truly combat effective. But with that, the battle for Guadalcanal was at an end, bar a few random Japanese army soldiers who would hold up and would continue to wage one-man wars for the foreseeable future. So where did this leave the 2 navies? Not counting submarines or small craft lost, or ships damaged and sent back for repairs, the major actions of the campaign, i.e. the big battles, had cost the Japanese 1 light carrier, 2 battle cruisers, 3 cruisers, and 7 destroyers. The US Navy had lost 2 fleet carriers, 7 cruisers plus 1 Allied cruiser, and 12 destroyers. On paper then, in addition to losing more of the set-piece engagements on a tactical level, the US Navy had also lost more ships, and more important ships, than the Japanese Navy. And both sides had long lists of badly damaged ships that would need months of repairs to make good. Indeed, with the conclusion of the Guadalcanal Campaign allowing Enterprise to head back for a much-needed overhaul, the US Navy was left with a single operational fleet carrier, USS Saratoga, which would in turn lead to the deployment of the USS Robin for a while, until new carriers could be brought online, whilst the Japanese had at least 3 fleet carriers of varying sizes left, even if 2 of them were a little on the small side. But, on the other hand, in the cold calculus of war, the US Navy had simply possessed more ships to lose in the first place. Whilst US strength might have been down to a dozen operational cruisers in the Pacific towards the end of 1942, by the end of 1943, newly built and repaired vessels had brought that number back up to strength. Plus, there were more cruisers in the Atlantic and more still on the slipways, whilst the Japanese Navy, although losing far fewer ships of this class, had been left with about the same number of operational frontline cruisers by the end of the campaign, and they had no second theatre to draw from, and nothing in the way of new ships on the production lines that would see service, save for a handful of small light cruisers. Likewise, the Fletcher production run meant that they were beginning to slide down the yards so fast that the deficit of destroyer losses, 5 in this case, had been made up by a few weeks' commissioning ceremonies. Moreover, the US Navy had entered the campaign very much behind the Japanese Navy in the realms of night battle actions and, to a degree, in carrier air group operations, something that its own men had been very pointed about, with one of them saying, "The requirement to be ready to execute simple tactics in the dark while engaging the enemy, I suppose, is one of the things that you'd expect naval officers who'd been taught from the time they became midshipmen. You could deduce a lot of crocodile tears and a lot of cliches, that all these poor guys didn't have any time to train together and so forth, and it's essential they'd be working together as a team and so on. Well, that's just so much balderdash. They should have been able to work together as a team on no advance notice whatsoever by virtue of working to a single uniform common US Navy doctrine, a single common signal book, which, of course, we've had for years and years." This sentiment was fairly widespread. But the US Navy had come out of the campaign with the start of a meaningful night battle doctrine and an increasing number of shipborne radars, a radically different anti-aircraft strategy, and a much improved operational tempo for its carrier air wings. In part, this was because the survivors of the campaign were in many cases brought home, debriefed, and then either reassigned to leaven up newly dispatched units, or retained to teach the next wave of sailors. Meanwhile, the elite corps of Kidobutai pilots had been savaged and would struggle to recover strength enough to crew what carriers remained to the Japanese Navy after the various battles of this campaign and those that had gone before, and many of the veteran ships and crews were simply left on the front lines until, inevitably, most would eventually be lost without having had much opportunity to pass on their experience, assuming that they hadn't been quietly reassigned to backwater areas in order to keep the more embarrassing battles away from the public eye. To give one example of this contrast, Bob Hagan, radar officer of the USS Aaron Ward, which had been lost in the first night of the naval battle of Guadalcanal, would be fished out of the water, dried off, shipped home, and then reassigned as the radar officer of the USS Johnston under one Captain Evans. Likewise, even the loss of Wasp and Hornet had been made good by spring 1943 with the arrival of 2 new Essex-class carriers, and of course a brutally Darwinian process had weeded out a number of US Navy admirals who would not, for one reason or another, command major US forces in battle ever again. So, what happened to the various admirals who'd led their forces into battle during the Guadalcanal Campaign? The respective fates of Admirals Yamamoto and Halsey are pretty well known, but of the other major players, Admiral Callahan had of course been killed in the first night action of the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Having been present in one way or another at 3 of the major engagements of the campaign, Admiral Norman Scott had also been killed in action on the same night. Of the various senior officers lost on both sides, he had by most measures shown the greatest potential as a fighting admiral before his untimely demise. Admiral Turner managed to stay on a career path that saw him lead a large number of further amphibious assaults over the course of the war, which he would survive as a full admiral. Admiral Fletcher was pretty unfairly sidelined in the aftermath of the First Battle of the Eastern Solomons, seeing out the war commanding the US Navy's efforts in the northern reaches of the Pacific. He would also survive the war as a full admiral. Admiral Wright would escape direct censure for his role in the Battle of Tassafaronga, but was reassigned to shore duty back in the continental United States, only briefly leading ships at sea one more time in 1944, retiring from the US Navy in 1948 as a rear admiral. Admiral Giffen would continue to command surface action forces and reach the rank of vice admiral, retiring in 1946. Admiral Lee would go on to command the US Navy's fast battleship force, but would never get a chance to exercise his spectacular gunnery skills in a major fleet action again. Still serving as a vice admiral in 1945, he would tragically die of a heart attack less than 2 weeks after the end of the war. Admiral Kincaid would go on to lead several US Navy forces, including leading 6 older US battleships at the night action of the Battle of Surigao Strait, destroying the Japanese Southern Force as part of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. He would retire as a full admiral in 1950. On the Japanese side of things, Admiral Goto was mortally injured aboard the Alba at the Battle of Cape Esperance and died aboard her later on the 12th of October 1942. Admiral Nagumo was moved to shore and second-line duties until assigned to lead the naval elements of the defence of Saipan, committing suicide towards the end of that campaign when it became clear that the battle was lost. Despite leading the successful withdrawal of troops from Guadalcanal, Admiral Hashimoto was reassigned to shore duty for most of the rest of 1943 before being given the 5th Cruiser Division. He would still be in this position as a vice admiral when his flagship, the Haguro, was swarmed by Captain Manly Power's 26th Destroyer Flotilla in a night action and sunk in May 1945. For his loss of the Hiei on the first night of the naval battle of Guadalcanal, Admiral Abe was relieved of command and forced to resign shortly after the end of the Guadalcanal Campaign, although he would survive the war, dying in 1949. For his loss of the Kirishima the following night and the overall failure of the Guadalcanal Campaign, Admiral Kondo was reassigned to shore duty, although he would be promoted to full admiral later in 1943 and would survive the war, which not many of his colleagues managed. Admiral Kurita would continue his career in the Japanese Navy, steadily gaining more important commands until he led the center force at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. After the failure of his ships at the Battle of Samar, he was relieved of seagoing command, but would also survive the war. Admiral Mikawa remained active during the Guadalcanal Campaign, but soon thereafter was made something of a scapegoat for the crime of not winning the campaign single-handed, and was sent to rear area commands, becoming increasingly convinced that no one was listening to him when he pointed out which campaigns were becoming massive wastes of lives and ships. He therefore chose to retire in May 1945 and made it to the age of 92. Admiral Tanaka was also hit with the charge of not winning his battles hard enough and sent to shore duty for the rest of the war. Although promoted to Vice Admiral later on, he was never given another seagoing command and would instead also survive the war, a trend amongst Japan's more competent admirals who, as a result of their skill, tended to be sent to languish in non-critical areas and thus missed the worst of the Allied advances in the latter part of the war. And that wraps up this channel's coverage of the major campaign elements of the Guadalcanal Campaign overall. This series would not have been possible without recourse to, amongst others, the wonderful narrative and further sources provided by James D. Hornfisher and his book Neptune's Inferno, the US Navy at Guadalcanal. Sadly, he passed away earlier this year before I could get a chance to extend an invitation to him to appear on this summary episode. Whilst I didn't know him personally, as many others did, I did have the honour to briefly work with him during the virtual VE Victory Parade event last year. He will be sorely missed by all who knew him, and by any naval historian who's interested in the activities of the US Navy in the Pacific War.